February 1st, 1959, somewhere past midnight, the northern Ural Mountains, Soviet Union. The temperature had dropped to 30 degrees below zero, and the wind coming off the exposed ridge known as Kholat Syakhl was moving at speeds that could strip the skin from an unprepared face in minutes. The mountain's name, translated from the indigenous Mansi language, meant Dead Mountain, and on this particular night, in this particular darkness, 9 young Soviet students were asleep inside a single canvas tent pitched on the mountain's eastern slope, their equipment organized, their campfire extinguished, their boots and outer layers removed as was standard cold weather practice. They were experienced hikers. They had trained for conditions exactly like these. Their leader, Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old engineering student from the Ural Polytechnic Institute in Sverdlovsk, had planned the expedition meticulously over months, mapping the route, calculating supply weights, assessing weather risks with the methodical precision of someone who understood that the Ural Mountains in February were not a landscape that forgave carelessness. The group had been moving through the region for days, making steady progress toward their destination, a peak called Otatorten, roughly 10 kilometers north of where they had chosen to camp that night. By all measurable standards, everything was proceeding exactly as planned. By morning, every single one of them would be dead, and the circumstances surrounding their deaths would remain so profoundly inexplicable that Soviet investigators, decades later, would close the official case file with a conclusion that has haunted researchers ever since. The 9 hikers had been killed by an unknown compelling force. The group had departed the city of Sverdlovsk on January 23rd, a team of 10 students and graduates, all members of the university's hiking club, all rated at the highest level of Soviet mountaineering certification. One member, Yuri Yudin, turned back early due to illness, a decision that would save his life and leave him to spend the remaining decades of it carrying the weight of survival guilt until his own death in 2013. The remaining 9 pressed on into the Ural wilderness. Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Zolotarev, Yuri Doroshenko, Georgy Krivonishenchenko, Rustem Slobodin, Nicholas Thibault Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov. They were young, idealistic, physically capable, and deeply committed to the expedition. Their final diaries, entries, and photographs, recovered later from the campsite, show a group in good spirits, laughing, making camp, documenting their journey with the casual confidence of people who had no reason to believe they would not return home. The last photographs taken by the group's cameras show them setting up their tent on the slope of Kholat Syakhl in the evening of February 1st. After that, the cameras recorded nothing. The diaries recorded nothing. Whatever happened in the hours that followed left no written testimony, no rational explanation, and no survivors. It was not until February 26th that a search party finally located the tent, and what they found there would define the mystery for the next 60 decades. The tent had been cut open from the inside, slashed with a knife in multiple places, the cuts deliberate and forceful, as though whoever made them had been in a state of extreme panic, requiring immediate exit at any cost. The hikers' belongings were still inside: food, equipment, boots, outer clothing. Whatever had driven them out of the tent had driven them out without time to dress, without time to gather supplies, without time to do anything except cut through the canvas and run. The footprints in the snow leading away from the tent showed a group of 9 people moving in a relatively orderly line down the slope toward the tree line below, a detail that investigators found deeply contradictory because panic sufficient to drive experienced mountaineers out of shelter in sub-zero temperatures without clothing should not have produced the calm, organized movement pattern the footprints suggested. The tracks led approximately 1.5 kilometers down the slope before disappearing into the wind-swept snow near the edge of the forest. What the search party found at the tree line made the mystery exponentially darker. Beneath a large cedar tree at the edge of the forest, search teams discovered the bodies of Yuri Doroshenko and Georgy Krivonishenchenko, both found in their underwear, barefoot, in temperatures that made survival outside without clothing physically impossible within minutes. The cedar tree's lower branches were broken, some snapped at heights of up to 5 meters, indicating that one or both men had climbed the tree, possibly to look for something, possibly to escape something, tearing their hands raw on the bark in the process. A small fire had been built nearby, long extinguished by the time the search party arrived, but the remnants confirmed that the two men had been alive long enough after leaving the tent to attempt survival. They had not succeeded. Between the cedar tree and the tent, spread across the slope at intervals, the bodies of Igor Dyatlov, Zinaida Kolmogorova, and Lyudmila Dubinina were found in positions that Soviet investigators described as suggesting the three had been attempting to return to the tent when they died. Dyatlov was found facing uphill, his arms wrapped around a small birch tree, frozen in a posture that looked less like collapse and more like an interrupted climb. Kolmogorova was found face down in the snow, her fists clenched, her expression, preserved by the cold, one of extreme physical effort. Slobotin was found with a small fracture in his skull, a detail initially noted and then quietly set aside in the preliminary report, its cause never officially explained. The remaining 4 hikers were not found until May, when the spring snowmelt exposed a ravine approximately 75 meters from the cedar tree, beneath 4 meters of accumulated snow. What the recovery teams found in that ravine shattered every theory that had been constructed in the preceding months. Lyudmila Dubinina, Alexander Zolotarev, Nicholas Thibault Brignol, and Alexander Kolovatov had clearly survived longer than the others, long enough to fashion makeshift clothing from garments cut from the bodies of the hikers who had died first, a detail so harrowing in its implications that it was suppressed from public reporting for years. But it was the physical condition of the 4 bodies that transformed the Dyatlov Pass incident into a tragic mountaineering accident into something genuinely inexplicable. Thibault Brignol had suffered a massive skull fracture so severe that Soviet forensic pathologist Boris Vozrojdeny described it as comparable to the force generated by a high-speed automobile accident. Dubinina and Zolotarev had multiple fractured ribs on both sides of their chests, the bones broken inward in a pattern consistent with an enormous compressive force applied simultaneously from multiple directions. And yet their skin showed no corresponding external bruising or trauma, a physical impossibility under any conventional explanation of blunt force injury. Most disturbingly of all, Lyudmila Dubinina was missing her tongue, her eyes, and the soft tissue around her lips, removed with a precision that excluded animal scavenging and has never been satisfactorily attributed to any known natural process. The Soviet investigation, led by Lev Ivanov, ran for months before arriving at its infamous conclusion. Ivanov, operating under significant pressure from regional Communist Party officials who wanted the matter resolved quietly, closed the case in May of 1959 with a finding so deliberately vague it raised more questions than it answered. The deaths, the official report stated, were caused by an unknown compelling force. No criminal charges were filed, no suspect was named. The region surrounding Kolovatsyakl was closed to hikers for 3 years following the incident, a restriction that Soviet authorities attributed to safety concerns, which researchers have long interpreted as evidence of something the government needed to conceal. Ivanov himself, decades later, after the collapse of the Soviet Union loosened the constraints on what could be safely spoken aloud, gave a series of interviews in which he revealed that during the original investigation he had personally observed evidence of what he believed to be anomalous radiation at the campsite, and that he had been explicitly instructed by party officials to exclude this evidence from the final report. He also stated that he had received reports from other search teams in the area describing strange glowing orange spheres moving through the sky above Kolovatsyakl on the night the hikers are believed to have died, reports that were similarly removed from the official record before the case was closed. The theories that have accumulated around the Dyatlov Pass incident in the decades since form a catalog of every conceivable explanation the human mind has produced in the face of genuine inexplicability. Avalanche was proposed and largely dismissed because the slope angle at the campsite was insufficient to generate the kind of snow movement required, and the footprint patterns leaving the tent showed no signs of the disorganized scramble an avalanche would have produced. Infrasound, the theory that low-frequency sound waves generated by wind moving over the mountain's unique topography could have induced mass panic in the hikers, has been explored seriously by physicists but cannot account for the catastrophic internal injuries found on the 4 bodies in the ravine.
Military testing in the region, specifically the possibility that the Soviet government was conducting secret weapons experiments in the Ural Mountains and that the hikers had inadvertently wandered into a test zone, has been raised repeatedly, and while it remains unproven, it is the only theory that simultaneously accounts for the physical injuries, the radiation traces found on certain items of clothing recovered from the campsite, the orange spheres reported in the sky, and the Soviet government's conspicuous urgency in closing the investigation and sealing the records. In 2019, Russian prosecutors reopened the case and announced a new official investigation, ultimately concluding that an avalanche or a slab of snow had been responsible for the deaths, a conclusion that was received by the international research community with widespread skepticism, and which failed to address the missing tongue, the internal injuries without external bruising, and the radiation evidence that had never been publicly explained. What endures about the Dyatlov Pass incident beyond the horror of its specific details is the absolute silence at its center. The silence of 9 people who knew exactly what happened